The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace, as Commander James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. His hands trembled slightly as he tucked the sealed envelope into his breast pocket. The weight of the document felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried during his 25 years of service to the crown. King Charles had called him into the private study just 3 days earlier. The monarch looked older than his years, his face etched with lines of stress and exhaustion. The conversation that followed would haunt Mitchell for the rest of his life. The king's voice was barely above a whisper as he explained his final decision, a choice that would shock the entire world and change the monarchy forever. "Commander Mitchell," the king had said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to ask of you goes against every protocol we've ever known. But sometimes a man must choose between his duty to the crown and his duty to his own conscience." The sealed envelope contained divorce papers, legally prepared and signed by the king himself. After months of private turmoil, scandals that threatened to destroy the royal family's reputation, and personal betrayals that cut deeper than any public criticism, Charles had made an unprecedented decision. He was ending his marriage to Queen Camilla, and he needed someone he trusted completely to deliver the news. Mitchell had served 3 generations of royals. He had protected them from assassins, terrorists, and overzealous fans. He had kept their secrets and defended their honor. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for this moment. He was about to deliver divorce papers to the Queen of England, acting on direct orders from the king himself. The palace staff moved about their morning routines, unaware that history was about to be made. Servants polished silver, gardeners tended to the roses, and security teams conducted their regular sweeps. Life in the palace continued its ancient rhythm, but for Mitchell, each step toward the Queen's private chambers felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff. As he approached the ornate doors of the Queen's sitting room, Mitchell could hear the familiar sound of classical music playing softly within. Camilla had always been an early riser, often spending her mornings reading correspondence and planning her royal engagements. She had no idea that her husband had spent the previous evening in his study, signing documents that would dissolve their union and send shockwaves through the Commonwealth. The king's decision hadn't come suddenly. Palace insiders whispered about heated arguments behind closed doors, about trust that had been broken beyond repair, and about revelations that had shattered the royal marriage. Charles had tried to maintain the facade of unity for the sake of the monarchy, but the burden had become too heavy to bear. The final straw had come just a week earlier, when evidence of Camilla's secret communications with certain members of the press had been discovered. Mitchell paused outside the door, his hand hovering over the brass handle. Inside this room sat a woman who believed she was secure in her position as queen, who had no knowledge of the storm that was about to engulf her life. In his pocket lay the power to change everything, to strip away titles and privileges that she had grown accustomed to over the years of their marriage. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, a career soldier who had sworn to protect the royal family, was now the instrument of their destruction. But the king had been clear in his instructions. This was not a betrayal of duty, but the ultimate act of service to the crown. Charles believed that only by ending this marriage could he save the monarchy from further scandal and preserve the institution for future generations. Taking a deep breath, Mitchell knocked 3 times on the door, the traditional signal that announced the presence of a royal guard. From within came Camilla's voice, warm and unsuspecting, calling for him to enter. As he turned the handle and stepped into the room, he carried with him the weight of royal tradition, the pain of a broken marriage, and the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The Queen looked up from her morning tea, a gentle smile on her face as she greeted the familiar guard. She had no idea that the next few minutes would transform her from Queen of England to a woman facing the complete upheaval of her carefully constructed life. The envelope in Mitchell's pocket seemed to burn against his chest as he prepared to deliver the most difficult message of his distinguished career. Queen Camilla set down her delicate china teacup and looked at Commander Mitchell with curious eyes. Something in his posture seemed different this morning. His usual confident bearing appeared strained, and there was an unusual tension in his shoulders that she had never noticed before during their brief interactions over the years. "Good morning, Commander," she said with her characteristic warm smile. "You look rather serious today. I hope everything is well with the security arrangements for this afternoon's charity event." Mitchell's throat felt dry as he struggled to find the words. The Queen sat elegantly in her favorite armchair, surrounded by fresh flowers and morning light streaming through the tall windows. She wore a soft blue dress that complemented her eyes, and her silver hair was perfectly styled as always. Everything about the scene spoke of normalcy, of routine royal life continuing as it had for years. "Your Majesty," Mitchell began, his voice slightly hoarse, "I'm afraid I'm not here about security arrangements. I come with a message from His Majesty the King." Camilla's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing her features. In all their years of marriage, Charles had never sent messages through the guard. Important communications between the royal couple were handled through private secretaries or delivered in person. The breach of protocol immediately put her on alert. "Is Charles quite well?" she asked, rising gracefully from her chair. "Has something happened? You look as though you're about to deliver terrible news." Mitchell reached into his breast pocket, his fingers closing around the envelope that felt like it contained dynamite. The Queen's eyes followed his movement, and he could see her maternal instincts kicking in as she prepared herself for news of an accident or illness affecting someone in the family. "His Majesty is in good health." "Your Majesty," Mitchell said carefully. "However, he has asked me to deliver this to you personally." He extended the envelope with hands that he willed to remain steady. Camilla accepted the envelope with growing confusion. The paper was heavy, official, and bore the king's personal seal, but there was something ominous about the formality of the delivery that made her hesitate before opening it. She had received thousands of official documents during her time as queen, but none had ever been delivered with such gravity by a royal guard. "Commander Mitchell," she said slowly, "perhaps you should sit down. Whatever this contains, I have a feeling we're both going to need a moment to process it." But Mitchell remained standing at attention, knowing that protocol demanded he maintain his position while delivering official communications. He watched as the Queen's elegant fingers broke the wax seal and unfolded the documents within. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock and the distant sounds of palace life continuing beyond the walls. As Camilla's eyes scanned the first few lines of the legal document, her face went completely pale. The papers slipped from her fingers and scattered across the Persian rug at her feet. She sank back into her chair as if the strength had suddenly left her legs, her hand moving instinctively to her throat in a gesture of shock and disbelief. "This cannot be real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Charles would never. Not like this. Not through a guard." Mitchell felt his heart breaking as he watched the Queen's world crumble before his eyes. He had witnessed many difficult moments during his service, but nothing compared to seeing a woman discover that her marriage was over through legal documents rather than a personal conversation. The king's pain had been evident when he made this decision, but seeing its impact on Camilla made the tragedy even more profound. "Your Majesty," Mitchell said gently, "His Majesty asked me to inform you that his private secretary will be available to discuss the practical arrangements. He also wanted you to know that this decision was not made lightly, and that he deeply regrets the pain it will cause." Camilla looked up at him with eyes that had filled with tears, but there was also a flash of anger beginning to build beneath the shock. The Queen, who had faced public criticism and media scrutiny for decades, was now confronting the ultimate rejection from the man she had married and supported through his reign. 20 years. "Commander," she said, her voice growing stronger despite the tears. 20 years of marriage, of standing by his side, of enduring criticism and judgment from people who never knew the real story. And this is how it ends? With a guard delivering papers like I'm some common citizen being served with legal documents? The weight of the moment pressed down on both of them as the full implications began to sink in. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the dissolution of a royal partnership that had defined the modern monarchy. Camilla would have to give up her title, her position, her entire identity as Queen of England. The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Camilla stared at the scattered papers on the floor, her mind racing to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. Commander Mitchell remained at attention, but inside he was struggling with emotions he had never expected to feel while performing his duty. "Tell me something, Commander," Camilla said finally, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. How long have you known about this? How long has Charles been planning to humiliate me in this way? Mitchell swallowed hard. The truth was that he had only learned of the king's decision 3 days ago, but he could see that Camilla suspected a wider conspiracy. Her years in the royal family had taught her to be suspicious of everyone around her, and now that paranoia was proving justified in the worst possible way. Your Majesty, I was informed of His Majesty's decision only recently. I want you to know that this was as much a shock to me as it is to you. Camilla laughed bitterly, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where tourists gathered daily to catch a glimpse of royal life. Soon she would no longer have any claim to this view, to these rooms, to the life she had built within these walls. A shock, she repeated. Yes, I imagine it was. Tell me, Commander, in all your years of service, have you ever been asked to destroy someone's life before breakfast? The question hit Mitchell like a physical blow. He had spent his career protecting people, saving lives, preventing disasters. Now he was the messenger of destruction, the instrument of a royal decision that would change everything. He wanted to apologize, to somehow soften the blow, but he knew that his role was to deliver the message, not to provide comfort. I need to see him, Camilla said suddenly, turning from the window with renewed determination. I need to see Charles immediately. He cannot do this without facing me, without explaining himself like a man instead of hiding behind legal documents and loyal guards. Your Majesty, Mitchell said carefully. His Majesty anticipated that request. He has asked me to inform you that he will not be available for private meetings until the legal proceedings are complete. His legal advisors have strongly recommended against any direct contact during this period. The words hung in the air like a slap. Camilla's face flushed with anger as the full extent of Charles's planning became clear. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated campaign, carefully orchestrated with legal advice and strategic planning. She had been outmaneuvered by her own husband. Legal advisors, she spat. Of course. How foolish of me to think that 20 years of marriage might warrant a personal conversation before lawyers and documents and royal guards became involved. She began pacing the room, her elegant composure finally cracking under the pressure. Mitchell watched as the Queen transformed before his eyes into a woman betrayed, her carefully maintained royal dignity giving way to raw human emotion. Do you know what the worst part is, Commander? She asked, stopping in front of him. It's not the divorce itself. Marriages end, even royal ones. It's the cowardice. Charles always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who faced difficult situations with courage and honesty. But this is the act of a weak man who couldn't bear to look his wife in the eye and tell her the truth. Mitchell found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't defend the king's methods without seeming to criticize the Queen, and he couldn't agree with Camilla's assessment without betraying his oath of loyalty to Charles. So he remained silent, a witness to the breakdown of a royal marriage and the human cost of decisions made in the corridors of power. There's something else, isn't there? Camilla said suddenly, studying Mitchell's face with the sharp perception that had served her well during years of political and social navigation. This isn't just about our marriage. Charles is protecting something or someone, what has happened, that made him so desperate to distance himself from me. The Queen's intuition was remarkably accurate. Mitchell knew that the king's decision had been triggered by specific events, revelations that had made continuing the marriage impossible from Charles's perspective. But those details were not his to share, and he could see that his silence was confirming Camilla's suspicions. I understand, Commander, she said with bitter resignation. You're a good soldier, and good soldiers follow orders without question. But remember this moment, because you're witnessing the end of more than just a marriage. You're watching the destruction of trust, of dignity, of everything that should matter in human relationships, royal or otherwise. As the reality of her situation began to sink in, Camilla's anger transformed into something more calculating and dangerous. She moved to her writing desk and pulled out her personal phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Mitchell watched with growing concern as he realized what she was doing. Your Majesty, he said urgently, perhaps it would be wise to speak with the royal press secretary before making any communications. Camilla looked up at him with eyes that had gone cold. Communications, Commander? I'm simply reaching out to some old friends, Surely even a soon-to-be former queen is allowed to maintain her personal relationships. Mitchell knew exactly what those communications meant. Camilla had maintained relationships with several prominent journalists throughout her time as queen. Connections that had often been useful for managing public perception of the royal family. Now those same relationships could become weapons in what was shaping up to be a very public and very messy royal divorce. The king's advisors have prepared a statement for the press, Mitchell offered, hoping to prevent what he could see coming. They've asked that all family members coordinate their responses to maintain consistency and protect the institution of the monarchy. The institution of the monarchy, Camilla repeated with a laugh that held no warmth. How interesting that Charles is suddenly so concerned about protecting the institution. Where was that concern when he decided to end his marriage through a royal guard, rather than having an honest conversation with his wife? She finished typing her message and set the phone aside, but Mitchell could see that this was only the beginning. The Queen had spent years learning how the royal publicity machine worked, and she was clearly prepared to use that knowledge to her advantage. "Let me ask you something, Commander," she said, returning to her chair with renewed composure. "Do you have any idea what those divorce papers actually contain? What generous settlement Charles has offered for 20 years of service to the crown?" Mitchell remained silent, but his expression must have revealed something because Camilla's smile turned predatory. "I see. So Charles expects me to simply disappear quietly, to fade away like a discarded mistress rather than a woman who stood beside him through scandals, criticism, and the enormous pressures of modern royal life. How very convenient for him." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made both of them turn toward the door. Mitchell recognized the quick, efficient pace of the king's private secretary, undoubtedly coming to begin the practical arrangements that would transform Queen Camilla back into Mrs. Parker Bowles. "Your Majesty," Mitchell said quietly, "I want you to know that I take no pleasure in this duty. You have always treated the palace staff with kindness and respect, and I regret that I had to be the bearer of such painful news." For a moment, Camilla's mask slipped and Mitchell could see the genuine hurt beneath her anger. "Thank you, Commander. That means more than you might realize. In a world where everyone seems to have their own agenda, basic human decency has become remarkably rare." The knock on the door interrupted them, and Mitchell moved to answer it. The king's private secretary, Edward Thornton, stood in the hallway with a leather briefcase and an expression of professional sympathy that didn't quite hide his discomfort with the situation. "Your Majesty," Thornton said as he entered the room, "I hope Commander Mitchell has had a chance to explain the situation. I'm here to discuss the practical arrangements and to answer any questions you might have about the proceedings." Camilla studied Thornton with the same calculating expression she had used with Mitchell. How thoughtful of Charles to send his finest people to handle his dirty work. "Tell me, Edward, how long have you been planning this little coup?" Thornton's professional composure wavered slightly. "Your Majesty, I want to assure you that His Majesty's decision was made with great reluctance and after considerable deliberation. This is not a decision he made lightly." "Considerable deliberation," Camilla repeated. "How long, Edward? How long has my husband been planning to divorce me, while still sharing my bed and accepting my support in public?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Both men could see that Camilla was not going to make this easy for anyone involved. She had been blindsided by the divorce papers, but she was not going to be steamrolled by the process. "There are certain financial arrangements that His Majesty hopes you will find acceptable," Thornton said, opening his briefcase and withdrawing another set of documents. "Given your years of service to the crown, he wants to ensure that you are provided for appropriately." Camilla's eyes flashed dangerously. "Provided for? Like a pensioned-off servant? How generous of the king to throw coins to his discarded wife." Mitchell could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly, and he began to understand why the king had chosen to handle the divorce through intermediaries rather than face Camilla directly. The woman sitting before them was not going to accept this humiliation quietly, and the royal family was about to face a crisis unlike anything they had experienced before. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense as Thornton spread the financial documents across Camilla's coffee table. Mitchell remained standing near the door, feeling like an unwilling witness to the systematic dismantling of a royal marriage. The papers detailed property divisions, financial settlements, and the removal of all royal titles and privileges that Camilla had held as queen. The settlement includes a substantial annual allowance, Thornton explained, his voice taking on the tone of a businessman presenting a deal, rather than a man discussing the end of a marriage. His Majesty has also agreed to allow you to retain your personal jewelry and the country estate in Gloucestershire. Camilla barely glanced at the documents. Instead, she reached for her phone again, and this time she made no attempt to hide what she was doing. Mitchell watched in alarm as she began placing calls to what were obviously media contacts. "Sarah? It's Camilla." "Yes, dear, I know it's early, but I have a story that will interest you greatly." Her voice was sweet and conversational, but Mitchell could see the steel beneath the surface. "The king has just served me with divorce papers through a royal guard." "Can you imagine? 20 years of marriage ended like a business transaction." Thornton looked horrified. "Your Majesty, please. The press statement isn't scheduled for release until this afternoon. This could create chaos if the news breaks prematurely." Camilla covered the phone and looked at him with mock concern. "Oh dear, Edward. Are you worried about chaos? How unfortunate. Perhaps Charles should have considered that before he decided to humiliate his wife in front of the palace staff." She returned to her phone conversation, and Mitchell could hear the excited voice of the journalist on the other end, asking rapid-fire questions. Camilla's responses were carefully calculated to present herself as the wronged party, while raising questions about the king's motivations and methods. "No, Sarah, I had no warning whatsoever. I was having my morning tea when a royal guard appeared with legal documents. Apparently my husband of 20 years felt that a personal conversation wasn't necessary." She paused, listening to questions. "Of course I'm shocked. Wouldn't you be if your spouse decided to end your marriage through lawyers and intermediaries, rather than having the courage to face you directly?" Thornton was frantically typing on his own phone, obviously trying to reach the royal press secretary to warn them about the impending media storm. Mitchell found himself caught between his duty to protect the royal family and his growing sympathy for a woman who had been treated with what seemed like deliberate cruelty. When Camilla ended her first call, she immediately began dialing another number. "James, it's Camilla." "Yes, I know you're preparing for the morning show. Well, I have something that will make your ratings soar." "Your Majesty," Mitchell said, stepping forward. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately before involving the media." Camilla looked at him with something approaching pity. "Commander, the media is the only power I have left. Charles has taken everything else. He's removed me from my position, my home, my entire identity, all through legal documents and palace staff. Did he really think I would simply disappear quietly into the countryside?" As she spoke to the second journalist, her story became more refined, more devastating. She spoke of betrayal, of cowardice, of a king who was so disconnected from basic human decency that he couldn't face his own wife to end their marriage. Each word was carefully chosen to maximize damage while maintaining her dignity. Thornton looked pale as he received what were obviously urgent messages from the press office. "Your Majesty, the palace is willing to reconsider the terms of the settlement if you would agree to coordinate with our media strategy." Camilla finished her second call and looked at him with amusement. "Reconsider the terms? How interesting. 5 minutes ago, these were the generous provisions of a caring husband. Now they're suddenly negotiable. What else might be negotiable, Edward?" She picked up the divorce papers and began reading them more carefully, and Mitchell could see her expression change as she absorbed the full details. Her face went from angry to shocked to something approaching fury. "He's claiming mental incompetence," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "Charles is claiming that I was not mentally competent to fulfill my duties as queen. This isn't just a divorce. It's a public assassination of my character and reputation." The revelation hit both men like a physical blow. Mitchell had not been told about the specific grounds for divorce, and Thornton's reaction suggested that even he had not fully understood the implications of the legal strategy. "Your Majesty," Thornton stammered, "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. The legal team may have included standard language without fully considering." "Without considering what, Edward? Without considering that I might object to being declared mentally unfit? Without thinking that I might have something to say about being portrayed as an unstable woman who was never qualified to be queen?" Camilla was no longer just angry. She was dangerous. Mitchell could see that the palace had seriously underestimated her reaction and her willingness to fight back. The woman standing before them was not going to accept character assassination as part of her divorce settlement. "Call your press secretary, Edward," she said with icy calm. "Tell them that they have exactly 1 hour to withdraw these papers and present me with a settlement that doesn't destroy my reputation. After that, I will be granting interviews to every major news outlet in Britain, and I will be telling them exactly what kind of man Charles really is when the cameras aren't rolling." The next hour became a frantic blur of phone calls, emergency meetings, and damage control efforts. Mitchell remained in the Queen's sitting room as requested, though he felt increasingly like he was watching a royal crisis unfold in real time. Thornton had disappeared to coordinate with the palace legal team, leaving Mitchell alone with a woman who had transformed from shocked victim to formidable opponent in the span of a morning. Camilla had changed from her morning dress into a sharp business suit. As if preparing for battle, she moved with purpose around the room, gathering personal items and important documents while maintaining a steady stream of phone calls to media contacts, legal advisors, and what Mitchell assumed were personal allies. 27 years I've known Charles," she said during a brief pause between calls, speaking more to herself than to Mitchell. "I've seen him at his worst moments, supported him through scandals that would have destroyed weaker men, and stood by him when his own children barely spoke to him. And this is how he repays loyalty." Her phone buzzed with an incoming call, and Mitchell could see from her expression that it was someone important. She answered with the regal bearing she had perfected during her years as queen. "William," she said, and Mitchell immediately understood that the Prince of Wales was calling. "How lovely to hear from you. Yes, I imagine you've heard about your father's rather dramatic morning announcement." Mitchell couldn't hear Prince William's side of the conversation, but he could see Camilla's face soften slightly as she listened. Despite everything that had happened, there seemed to be genuine affection between her and her stepson. "No, darling, I don't blame you for not knowing. Your father has apparently been planning this little coup for some time, without consulting anyone who might have advised him against such spectacular cruelty." She paused, listening. "Yes, I understand your concern about the monarchy, but perhaps you should have that conversation with the man who decided to wage war against his own wife, rather than behave like a civilized human being." As the conversation continued, Mitchell began to understand the broader implications of what was happening. This wasn't just a royal divorce. It was a crisis that threatened to split the entire royal family. Prince William was obviously trying to mediate, but Camilla's hurt and anger were too deep for easy resolution. "I appreciate your position, William," she said finally, "but I will not be destroyed quietly to protect your father's reputation. If Charles wanted to handle this with dignity, he should have spoken to me personally instead of sending guards and lawyers to do his dirty work." When she ended the call, Camilla looked at Mitchell with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Even the future king is trying to convince me to accept humiliation for the good of the monarchy. Tell me, Commander, at what point does loyalty become self-destruction?" Before Mitchell could respond, Thornton returned with 2 other men Mitchell didn't recognize. One was clearly a lawyer, carrying multiple briefcases and wearing the harried expression of someone who had been pulled into a crisis at short notice. The other appeared to be from the palace communications team. "Your Majesty," Thornton said carefully, "we've reviewed the situation and we're prepared to discuss modifications to the settlement terms." Camilla looked at them with the expression of a predator who had cornered her prey. "How generous. And the mental incompetence claim?" The lawyer stepped forward nervously. "That language has been removed from all documents. It was included in error based on standard templates and does not reflect His Majesty's actual position." "His Majesty's actual position," Camilla repeated. "How interesting that the king's actual position changes so quickly when faced with consequences. What else has changed in the last hour?" The communications officer cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, we're prepared to offer a substantially increased settlement, retention of certain honorary titles, and a coordinated media statement that presents the divorce as a mutual decision." Camilla studied the new documents they presented, taking her time to read every detail. Mitchell could see that she was no longer the shocked woman who had received the original divorce papers. She had transformed into a skilled negotiator who understood exactly how much power she held. "This is better," she said finally, "but it's still not acceptable. You see, gentlemen, you've made a fundamental error in your calculations. You've assumed that I want to preserve the monarchy's reputation, But why should I protect an institution that has just tried to destroy me? The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Mitchell realized that Camilla wasn't just fighting for a better settlement. She was prepared to bring down the entire royal family if necessary, to protect her own dignity. Here are my terms, she continued, her voice taking on the authority she had wielded as queen. Full restoration of financial provisions that reflect my actual contributions to the crown over 20 years. Public acknowledgement that this divorce is Charles's decision alone, not a mutual agreement. And most importantly, a personal apology from the king for his cowardly and humiliating treatment of his wife. She stood and faced all of them with the bearing of a woman who had nothing left to lose. You have until sunset to present Charles with these terms. After that, I will be granting a live television interview where I will discuss not just this divorce, but everything I know about the real character of the man you call king. The threat hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Mitchell could see that the palace representatives were beginning to understand that they had seriously underestimated their opponent, and that this crisis was far from over. As the sun began to set over Buckingham Palace, Mitchell found himself back in the king's private study, the same room where this crisis had begun just 3 days earlier. Charles sat behind his desk looking like a man who had aged years in a single day. The confident monarch who had signed the divorce papers had been replaced by someone who understood that his carefully planned strategy had backfired spectacularly. She's not going to accept any of the revised terms, is she? Charles asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Mitchell stood at attention, but his expression conveyed the gravity of the situation. Your Majesty, with respect, the Queen feels that the manner of the divorce delivery was deeply hurtful and humiliating. She's not just negotiating financial terms. She's fighting for her dignity and reputation. The king rubbed his temples, a gesture Mitchell had seen many times during periods of royal crisis. I thought if I handled it through official channels, it would be cleaner, more dignified somehow. Personal confrontations are so messy. Your Majesty, Mitchell said carefully. Queen Camilla has been granting interviews to major news outlets throughout the afternoon. The palace communications team is struggling to control the narrative. Charles looked up sharply. What has she said? She's focused primarily on the method of divorce delivery and the initial mental incompetence claims. She's portrayed herself as a loyal wife who was betrayed and humiliated by a husband who lacked the courage to face her directly. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Charles was once again avoiding direct confrontation with his wife, even as they discussed her public criticism of exactly that behavior. The Prime Minister has called twice, Charles continued. Parliament is concerned about constitutional implications if this becomes a prolonged public battle. And William is furious with me for not consulting him before proceeding. Mitchell remained silent, but he could see that the king was beginning to understand the full scope of the disaster he had created. What was meant to be a quiet, dignified end to a troubled marriage had become a very public royal crisis that threatened the stability of the monarchy itself. Commander, Charles said finally, I need you to deliver one more message to Camilla. But this time I want you to arrange for me to speak with her personally. No lawyers, no intermediaries, just the two of us. Your Majesty, your legal advisors have strongly recommended against direct contact until— Damn the legal advisors, Charles interrupted with uncharacteristic anger. They've created this mess with their templates and their strategies. It's time for me to handle this like a man instead of hiding behind protocols and procedures. Mitchell could see that the king had finally grasped what everyone else had understood from the beginning, that ending a 20-year marriage required more than legal documents and professional intermediaries. It required human decency and personal courage. An hour later, Mitchell stood once again outside Camilla's sitting room, but this time he carried a very different message. When he knocked and entered, he found the former queen preparing for what appeared to be a major television interview. Professional cameras were being set up, and a makeup artist was touching up her appearance. Commander Mitchell, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, have you come to deliver more legal documents? Or has Charles finally found the courage to face his wife? Your Majesty, Mitchell said, His Majesty has requested a private meeting with you this evening. No lawyers, no staff, just the two of you to discuss the situation directly. Camilla paused in her preparations and studied Mitchell's face. After 3 days of lawyers and threats and character assassination, now he wants to talk? How convenient, just as I'm about to tell the world exactly what kind of man they've crowned as their king. He acknowledges that the process has been handled poorly, Mitchell said carefully. He wants the opportunity to explain his decisions and to discuss terms that might be acceptable to both parties. The room fell silent except for the quiet movements of the television crew setting up their equipment. Camilla looked at the cameras, then back at Mitchell, clearly weighing her options. "Tell Charles that I'll meet with him," she said finally, "but only after my interview airs tonight. If he wants to salvage anything from this disaster, he can watch me tell the truth to the nation first. Then we'll see if he's prepared to offer something more than revised legal documents." As Mitchell prepared to leave, Camilla called out to him one final time. "Commander, you've been caught in the middle of something that should never have involved you. I want you to know that none of this changes my respect for your service or your character. You've conducted yourself with honor throughout this entire ordeal." Mitchell felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he realized that his role in this crisis was finally coming to an end. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I hope that both you and His Majesty can find a resolution that preserves everyone's dignity." As he walked back through the palace corridors, Mitchell reflected on the events of the past few days. He had witnessed the breakdown of a royal marriage, the near collapse of careful palace planning, and the power of a woman who refused to be destroyed quietly. Most importantly, he had learned that even kings and queens were ultimately just human beings, capable of the same mistakes, pride, and pain as anyone else. The crisis was far from over, but Mitchell could see that it had already changed everyone involved. The king had learned that royal authority couldn't replace human decency. Camilla had discovered her own strength in the face of betrayal, and the monarchy itself had been reminded that public respect must be earned rather than simply expected. Whatever happened in the meeting between Charles and Camilla that night, the palace would never operate quite the same way again.